Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kakwana Cricket Cast. I'm your host, Pratham. I'm joined by Stuff from the King Pair podcast and Sanket. You may know him from his Twitter bio. And today we're going to be discussing something that's pretty interesting, sort of a marquee event of the calendar year, the World Test Championship Final. It's being played at the Oval, and India and Australia are facing off each other. Kind of already been doing that in Test cricket of late, but this is the culmination of everything that's been happening in 2 years. So it's a very very important event, and to sort of just preview it, we've all assembled together. So we'll be giving you thoughts about that. But first, I want to thank Sanket and Navan Stuff for being on the show, and how you guys have been doing.
Yeah, I've been doing well, and it's nice to talk about this right before the final about to start. So, yeah, let's just dive right into this.
Indeed. And yeah, Sanket, how have you been doing?
Yeah, not too bad. I think it's been a long time since we did a podcast over here. So yeah, I think good to be here like just after a very long IPL back to Test cricket and talking about the WTC final.
It's good to be back talking about Test. For me, it's always. But yeah, a lot to cover. I think the first thing we've got to keep in mind, it's always a topic that comes in discussions, and there's always sort of an ambiguity to this, right? We don't know for certain how it's going to be, but there are questions about always how the pitches are going to be prepared in the lead up to a match, and I think this test is no different. We're playing at the Oval, and there's a lot of theories that are flying around about the state of the pitches and so forth. Some people are of the opinion that the Oval, based off past experiences, that there is a value in playing spinners here. The ball turns in the latter stages of the matches. A couple of matches in that regard come to mind. In Pakistan versus England in 2016, there was some turn on offer there for Yasir Shah. A couple of other games as well. So there are theories that are posited about the nature of the surface. Now, what we can tell based off some of the pitches that have been prepared recently in county cricket, some of the indications that have been there have suggested that the surfaces have been a lot quicker than normal. There was a cricketer, Sean Ibett, who was interviewed recently, who's been playing some of the matches at the venue in the county championship, and he described how the slips have been having to stand a little bit further back, and that the surface in general has been a lot, a little bit more bouncier and has had more pace and so forth. So if that holds to repute, if those conditions hold as they're alleged to currently stand, there is an idea that you're going to probably see a surface that's going to be on a quicker and bouncier side of things. And I'm interested to get your take, guys. What do you make of that? Do you think that is going to be the case? Do you think that if it is going to be the case, how is that going to affect the teams? And what do you think? Who holds the cards or advantage here, given those circumstances? So over to you, Navan, first.
A lot of those quicker, bouncier pitches were sort of early season, as winter hasn't fully gone away in England, and it's really started to get quite hot in England recently. So I feel like some of that, some of the greenness, some of the freshness from the pitches might go away a bit in the heat. So I think we will probably see something more like a traditional oval pitch, because again, with the Oval, the pitches usually end up like that because the Oval tends to host games at the end of the summer. I think this is actually the first test the Oval has hosted in June ever. So it might play a little bit more livelier than the traditional Oval pitch, but I think it won't be as extreme as we saw at the start of the county season.
Fair enough. And obviously the ICC is going to be involved in that process, right?
Yeah, for sure.
There's a and that it is an event of that sort. Of course, the local curator is going to actually, you know, have involvement in preparing the pitch, but there is going to be ICC oversight in that regard. And so obviously the nature of the surface may not be like how it is domestically held. Sanket, your thoughts about just the entire pitch discussion?
Yeah, firstly, I don't think we've had any images of the pitch. Whatever we discussed is purely based on speculation, based on whatever we've read in the media, but purely based on whatever we've heard from England as well. Like Ben Stokes has ordered fast, flat pitches for the Ashes, and what we've seen in this Ireland test as well, like England Ireland test, Ireland just scored 360 odd in the second innings against England. So I think that tells you a little bit about the pitch. And that this is Lords, which has generally been one of the most bowler-friendly pitches in recent years. Uh, and you would expect that to continue. The weather has been relatively dry. It's cold, but it's not raining. And given that you don't have England in the in final, so I don't think there is any question of any home team doctoring as such. So the conditions will be the pitch will be prepared by the ICC. So you would expect a surface which is the typical oval surface, and generally the surface of the oval always has been dependent on the overhead conditions. Like the test against South Africa last summer ended in less than 2 days of effective play. Because 2.5 days were almost rained off, and it ended early on day 5. Despite that, because of the weather, inclement weather, and it was an extremely low scoring test. I think, if I'm not mistaken, probably the lowest scoring oval test in more than a century, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, so you've seen that side of it, and you've also seen double hundreds and triple hundreds being scored at the oval in the not too distant past. So I think if the weather is good, and if it's similar to what it has been over the past couple of weeks, and as is being forecast, it's a dry week, then I think you would expect a reasonably decent batting surface. And obviously you're still using the Duke's ball, so it won't be like an Australian pitch, where you have the Kookaburra and it goes really flat after uh, a while. But again, we saw it last summer as well, that the Duke's ball went soft after a few overs. Up. So I think I would expect reasonably decent batting conditions. Definitely don't expect anything of the sort that we saw in the last WTC final, wherein we managed to get a result in it was the 6th day, but effectively it was 2.5 days of effective cricket. I don't think that will be the case here. I think I would expect the test to at least go, assuming that there is no rain, at least 4 days, and maybe even if the sides do bad.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, the point about the Dukes is a really interesting one, because they have, there has been comments from the manufacturer, right, Dukes themselves, acknowledging that the balls went out of shape last summer, and obviously that was a major facet in advantaging the home side, right, advantaging the home side at hand, right, in that England, with their more aggressive approach towards batting and tests, were able to capitalize on the fact that the ball was going out of shape with the Dukes, and becoming just in general less helpful for the bowlers, especially as the innings went along. So from my understanding, they are working on a replacement. That's the idea for this season, basically this patch of season. They do it on a seasonal basis. So there, like you mentioned, there's probably going to be a little bit more, naturally, because of the seam and the thicker seam, the better stitching probably on offer. It's probably going to be a better chance for the ball to move around a little bit. But yes, I tend to concur. I think this is going to be a largely a fairly good batting track. I do wonder if it's going to take some spin, especially if it's going to, if it's held in largely dry conditions. I do wonder if there's going to be enough, wear and tear on the wicket come day 4, day 5, where it may actually make sense to play multiple spinners or not in those circumstances. So that is something that is yet to be seen. But yes, if I tend to agree with you guys, I think it's going to be mainly a good wicket to bat on. I think there's going to be a little bit more pace and bounce than people would anticipate. With the stereotype of a English, pitch. I've always found those stereotypes to be a little bit ridiculous, to be honest. It depends on the day to day with the match, but I do think that's going to be the case here. So, with that said, let's actually get to the teams at hand, right? And the squads at hand. So, as you would expect for a final like this, a lot of the selections are penciled in. We know where people are going to be stood. The entire point of the 2-year cycle leading up to this was to sort of finalize your team essentially for this one-off major contest. Um, so there are names that we know that are going to make it into the squad. I don't think it's really all that useful to talk about some of the established names that are going to be there. Someone like a Virat, for example, especially with that Ahmedabad 100, is going to make it. Cummins, if he's fit, is going to make it. Smith, Labuschagne and all. But I want to talk about some of the more fringe aspects of selection, right? And not necessarily even the most fringe players, because I think some of these players are regulars. They'll make it to the setup, but where they bat even, or where they what is the extent of the involvement is important. And we'll start with India, and there's a lot of because I would say there's more selection questions in mind for India than Australia. I think Australia have a slightly more settled side in that regard. And I think the first question that's been on the minds of everyone actually has to do with the decision of your fifth bowler, right? Who's it going to be? There seems to be an understanding that there's going to be 3 pacers that are going to be playing. There are frontline pacers. Now, which of those bowlers is going to be the third seamer is a different question, and that's something we'll also discuss. But there is a composition, an attack composition thought process here, where you could go in with 3 pacers who are don't have many merits with that, to be blunt, and then a pace bowling all-rounder in Shardul Thakur, or you could go in with 3 pacers and 2 spinners, Jadeja and Ashwin being those, and in the other situation you would also have a spinner, and you would pick one of the 2. So, in terms of the combinations we're looking at, what do you guys think are like? What do you think are the merits of picking 2 of the 3? If you had to pick 2 of the 3, Jadeja, Ashwin, and then Thakur, what's the thought process that you guys have in mind? The debates over selection of those. How are you leaning towards those, and what do you think would be in the best interest for India for this particular match?
So I think that if you're going in with 3 out-and-out pacers, then I would personally think India would be better off served with playing both Jadeja and Ashwin instead of Thakur, unless the pitch is it looks like it's going to be very much a seamer-friendly pitch. Because I think India's 3 out-and-out fast bowlers, they're good enough on most surfaces, especially the sort of surface you'd expect from the oval, to get by themselves without the need for a 4th one. And then Jadeja and Ashwin, they offer a lot more in every other aspect than Thakur, except for maybe the pace of batting. But I think if you need someone to bat long, I'd probably rely more on Jadeja and Ashwin than Thakur. I think they're both better fielders, and I think they just offer that extra dimension that Thakur doesn't, which is solid spin options. And we forget this sometimes, but Test cricket is a long game, and it does help to have bowlers who you can sort of rely on to slow the pace down a little bit and sort of take control back of the match by bowling pretty long spells, which is something that you wouldn't expect the 3 pacers to do, and you wouldn't expect Thakur to do.
No, I think that's a really good point. If it seems increasingly that the debate is largely scheduled around between the 3, right? It seems like Jadeja is more of a given because of his lower order batting capabilities that are greater than Ashwin. So the debate seems to be centered around Ashwin and Thakur. And we did just have recently a performance from Ashwin on a pitch that was fairly friendly to bat on in Ahmedabad, to say the least. There was some odd ball that had some inconsistent bounce to it, and there was a hint of turn, but by and large it was a pretty good surface to bat. And so and there he took 6 wickets for in 47 overs, I believe, at the cost of 91 runs, right? Which is a very impressive performance, but it's also impressive in the context of the control he provides, right? And there is an argument that Ashwin provides, even when he's not necessarily taking wickets, he provides I'd say a greater semblance of control than Thakur in that regard. I will be honest, I have never been a fan of Shardul Thakur, the bowler. I don't know how he gets wickets sometimes. Sometimes I do. In South Africa when he took that seventh off, I saw him using the scramble seam to decent effect. Um, but he's always mystified me as to how he manages to stay within the wickets columns and so forth. Um, but again, he may be an option to consider if, like you mentioned, the pitch was had a little bit more in it. But Sanket, where do you lie in this debate? What do you think about this
Uh, so yeah, I think pretty much the same. Uh, Given the conditions that are expected, like I think we already discussed. Although, as I said, it is right now it is only speculation because we've not had an actual look at the pitch. But I think unless the conditions are like really, really seem to be, the spinners become almost unbowlable. Like maybe the conditions like, for example, the Lord's Test of 2018 when India played with two spinners, with one of them being Kuldeep. That was a horrible selection, but people talk about the WTC final in 2021 and how selecting Ashwin is what cost them the match. But Ashwin is actually one of the better bowlers in that match. So Ashwin's selection is not what isn't what cost them. And, then they played four seamers in the series against England, and then they were leading that series, and then one of the tests got postponed by a year, and eventually the series was drawn. But that is seen as an evidence that the four seamer strategy works better for them in English conditions. But I don't necessarily buy that. I think that's way too small a sample size to draw any conclusions from. And they lost to New Zealand because New Zealand had a much better pace attack. And that would have been the case even if India had played Shardul Thakur instead of Ashwin. Ashwin is not the reason they lost that test. And Kane Williamson played a fantastic innings. So I think there is like a lot of probably unfair conclusions being drawn on the basis of that sample size of that one test. So I still think when if you look at the last time when India beat Australia outside the subcontinent, which was obviously in Australia on a green top at Melbourne, it was Ashwin who actually broke open the game on day one. And those conditions were actually very very similar to what you're going to get in England. Pitch was a green top. Pitch of the oval would probably be flatter, and the weather was like more similar to what you would expect this week rather than the typical English weather, which is very inclement. So I think Ashwin has shown that he can take wickets in conditions which are not necessarily tailor made for spin. He did not have the greatest approach in South Africa, but that was in conditions like I said, those were like proper green tops. Like those are conditions that are designed to take spinners out of the game. I don't think the track at the oval will be that. So unless the conditions are doctored in a way which is meant to completely eliminate spin bowling altogether, I cannot see any situation in which Shardul Thakur becomes a better bowling option than Bharat International. And let's not forget, even if he's not taking wickets, what you would want from your fourth bowler is to provide control. So with Ashwin, that he's not going to go for more than 3 runs an over, even on his worst days. Whereas Shardul Thakur, he's someone who can single-handedly lose you a game in single spells. So to me, I think it's a no-brainer. Ashwin has to play.
I think that's again I largely share those sentiments. I will mention that Ashwin's inability to break through entirely, right? In I'd say a lot of surfaces that aren't exactly all that conducive. Over a larger set of things, I do feel that is an issue from that perspective. If he's going to be bowling a lot of overs, but as you guys mentioned, he provides control in that regard. I will also mention that Melbourne pitch that you mentioned, it did offer a decent amount of turn for spinners. It was very much a bowler's paradise for all things considered. I did find his South Africa performances a bit disappointing, not because they necessarily offered a lot of tone, but there was a lot of inconsistent bounce on offer. And Ashwin being a tall spinner, you would expect a decent spinner to exploit that a little bit more, in my expectation, especially with that degree of inconsistency in bounce and pace. A lot of the surfaces, I wouldn't really characterize as green tops, but that sort of irregularity in bounce with the little bit of seam movement, I think contributed to the low-scoring series at hand. But I think your points are valid, right? I don't have, especially when we saw what happened against England. Now, granted, England were playing in that fifth test that completed the series that happened 1 year after. Granted, they were playing a more aggressive brand of cricket. I don't think Australia will necessarily default to that. But we did see that if Shardul has a bad day, he can very much be taken on and smashed entirely. And
Another thing to like probably point out here is that a lot of the batsmen in the Australian side currently don't have a great record against Ashwin. Like Steve Smith used to dominate Ashwin like until the 2021 tour, but over the last couple of series, Ashwin has had the vote over him. He's had the vote over Manas Labuschagne. Ash Warner and him go back like 10 years. Like he's pretty much nominated him for the entirety of his career. And there's Travis Head, who handled him all right in the recent series in India, but the left-hander against Ashwin, you would always fancy Ashwin there. And Alex Carey, again, we saw what happened in the recent Test series. So
yeah, the less said, the better. Right?
Yeah, so I think if you just ask every single batter in the Australian side, I don't think there is any single batter who would say that they would rather face Ravichandran Ashwin than Shardul Thakur, irrespective of the pitch is like.
Yeah, I think that's.
And I think like on Thakur again, if he goes for runs, if he plays, India's pace bowling attack is a little weakened already because Bumrah is not playing, and that's a huge loss for them. So India's like their three frontline seamers, they're already hit a little in terms of reliability and depth. So you can't really have a player prone to going for a lot of runs like Thakur is, on top of the third seamer selection, which is, we'll get to in a little bit, is also a little bit uncertain and a little unproven on that respect. So it might be considered to be playing it a little bit too safe, but having two reliable bowlers who may not run through teams, but you can at least depend on them to not go for a lot of runs every time, in Ashwin and Jadeja would be a lot more safe and a lot more secure than taking the risk on Thakur.
I think that's well said. Actually, speaking of the third seamer, let's talk about that. For India, so we know that Shami and Siraj are I would say the guarantees on this in this bowling lineup for them, but they do have two pace bowling options that could fit in that third seamer role. They could also play Thakur as the third seamer role, but assuming they don't, and they go in with that three frontline seamers who are picked for their bowling merits alone, you have Jadeja Unadkat, and then you have Umesh Yadav. Now, I have some thoughts about this, and I don't think it's particularly a great situation for India either ways. But I would first like to hear your thoughts about if you had to pick Unadkat or Yadav, which way you're leaning. So Sanket, who would be your third seamer for India if you were selected?
Yeah, I think just expanding on what Naban was talking about regarding the control and what I had mentioned as well. India are the underdogs in this test, so I think they have to. And if you see the last tour of Australia, which is when again they were the big underdogs and they pulled off a win against the odds. How did they win it? It was through bowling dry. They had developed a very specific strategy crafted by Bharat, Arun, and Ravi Shastri, wherein they bowled with a heavy leg side field and bowled pretty much stump to stump. And the strategy was designed to keep a lid on the run scoring rather than necessarily looking to take wickets. And the wickets happened as a byproduct of that. And that is how they won in Australia last time around. So I think that they have to follow the same policy. To go searching for wickets, thinking that you're going to be aggressive, I think that almost never works. Like for underdogs, like sometimes teams think that because they're underdogs, they would go for the options which are high variance, that if they come off on a particular day, then they can single-handedly win you the match. But that very rarely happens. That is almost never happens. And this is Test cricket. This is not T20 cricket, wherein you will have players who can fluke a good performance and win your match out of nowhere. Here, teams with follow the right process over a longer period of time will win. So I think India, for them, the best chance in this particular scenario is again to follow what they did, like what worked for them in the past. Keep a lid on the run scoring, and just hope that Australian batsmen make mistakes. Just stay in the game for a longer period of time, and then pounce whenever you have that opportunity. Which means again going in with the guy who's got a superior amount of control. Which again I think it should be obvious by now whom I'm referring to, and that is Jadeja. We saw what happened to Umesh Yadav in the last test at Ahmedabad. On a flat surface, he was taken apart by Cameron Green and Usman Khawaja. And he's lost a lot of pace as well. He's I think almost 35, 36. Uh, at this age, for a fast bowler who's never really been effective in conditions outside of the subcontinent where there is significant amount of risk, for him to expect him to do well in England at this age, right now, given his form and his fitness, like he did not play much in the IPL as well. Whenever he played, he did not appear to be the bowler he was last season. Last season, he was one of the better new ball bowlers in the IPL. I know it's a different format, but I think it tells you. I think you do get a fair idea about a fast bowler's rhythm, even watching those two overs with the new ball. And Umesh Yadav, over the last few months, has looked to shadow the bowler that he was like even 12, 18 months back. So I think that again, like Unadkat, I'm not the biggest fan of Unadkat. I think if you'd asked me like whom I would rather pick in this squad, I think they could have taken a gamble on maybe even someone like an Arshdeep Singh, even though he doesn't have a lot of first class experience, but purely based on the eye test and whatever I've seen of him in the limited overs formats, I think he's someone who has the raw materials. He's got the height, he's got the pace, he's got the swing to be a decent red ball bowler as well. But they've not really gone down that route. So Unadkat is your tried and tested first class performer. Uh, I'm not necessarily convinced that he's going to be a great test bowler. But as I said, out of the options that they have in the squad right now, with Umesh and Shardul being the other options, I think he's clearly the safest.
Fair enough. And Stuff, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. We were just talking about like you want a more experienced hand, and just looking at the numbers, Umesh has played 50 more tests than Unadkat has, but and he's also older. But I think Unadkat would be the safer pick here again because he has more reliably consistent bowler, less prone to going for a lot of runs like Yadav has the last few times he's played in the test side. And Unadkat also, like, he's just a very experienced first-class player. He's played more first-class games than Umesh has, and he's been toiling away. The 10 years between his first and second test, he's just been toiling away, and he's won the Ranji Trophy, captained his team to a Ranji Trophy title in that time. And I think that's it's both a good reward for him for playing, sticking through the system this whole time and not trying to change his game too radically to become a T20 specialist like some others might have. So it's a good reward for him to play in one of India's biggest test matches, like one of the biggest matches they can play, which is the World Test Championship final. And it also, just the way the game is set up, it suits his skill set a lot more than it does Umesh. He's also a left armer, which again gives India a point of difference, which Umesh might not. And the other two seamers are also both right arm quick bowlers. So again, I think Unadkat is just the more reliable player in these conditions.
I think you made some really salient points there, especially with the left-hander angle. And yeah, I mean, my perspective on this, again, it is going to depend on the pitch, right? I do think that if you have a pitch that looks very arid comparatively speaking, right, and you think there is an option for that, Umesh's sort of length there, his sort of lines, aiming at stumps and so forth, could be useful. But I doubt that it's going to be the case. And I lean towards Unadkat for very similar reasons as you guys. I would say, Sanket, this is a difference of philosophies here. I don't think necessarily the team that's the underdog wins, per se, by bowling, by adopting more runs, restrictive philosophies per se. Always, I think it has more down to the planning and execution, right? Like I recall, the West Indies, for instance, when in '94, '95, when they were top, Australia had, despite having McGrath and Morn, they were fairly, greenhorn bowlers, and they had largely won that series because Mark Taylor had very specific, often sometimes aggressive plans against specific batsmen in the lineup. And with a limited bowling attack, he really went, gunning for them. And I can name a bunch of other instances in that way. So there's a difference in thought process there. What I do think Unadkat has the advantage over Yadav. You mentioned the left arm angle, and I think that's definitely useful, especially if they're playing Ashwin. Some of the footmarks that you can create for Ashwin could be very useful in that hand. The other aspect is Unadkat is 6'2", 6'3". Umesh Yadav is 5'10", 5'11", from my understanding. He's a lot taller of a bowler, and the evidence that we saw in that one-off game in Bangladesh. Now, granted, that was a very bowler-friendly surface, right? It was green. I think it was in Mirpur. It was green. It offered, a significant degree of bounce and pace in the seam movement. I would say more than even bounce and pace, seam movements. Um, and Unadkat did impress there. He bowled incredibly accurately in that first innings. What I did notice, and Sanket, this is probably where you and me agree on this a lot. As that second inning started to come in, when the pitch was not offering much, he didn't look very impressive at all, to be quite frank. That's always something that I've worried about with Unadkat. He's become much more of a hit the deck style bowler. In his early days, he used to really, sort of gently swing it in and away, and it's why he, after that one-off test where he was really bowling fairly slow by international standards, he was dropped and he wasn't picked again. He's improved that a little bit. He doesn't bowl especially quick, but he, I'd say averages about 130 now. And again, with that height, he'll get a little bit of extra bounce. So I think that's the major advantage that I'd have. And the reason why I'd also mention that is India's bowling attack is a bit, if I'm to be polite, vertically challenged, right? Most of their bowlers are 5'10", 5'11". Ashwin is probably the exception, and even he's slightly above 6 foot, 6'1", I think. And Australia has the taller bowling attack, so especially if there's any kind of inconsistency in bounce that we see, especially when it comes to the third or fourth innings, India can often get taken to the cleaners because they aren't able to exploit the inconsistency in bounce as much as, say, other teams. And evidence of that was in South Africa, where they lost that series. I would argue because of that inability for the inconsistency in bounce to be exaggerated. Also in the one-off test in England, and that surface was flat from the perspective of it didn't really offer much in terms of movement off the deck come fourth innings. But there was some inconsistency in bounce even then. It was mostly a flat pitch, no doubt, but there was some inconsistency in bounce there, and I think a taller bowler would have been very useful. Sanket, to that point, right? You mentioned Arshdeep Singh. I was of the opinion that they should have groomed somebody as a replacement for Ishant Sharma. Arshdeep was one of the options I was considering. Ishan Porel, I don't know what he has to do to get more game time. I know he was injured. They sent him to Australia, but he's been in the radar. He's been a good bowler for them in domestic. One of the leading bowlers for his side, as a matter of fact. And I think there's been a massive inability to reckon with the fact that with the loss of Ishant Sharma, you're losing that bowler who can provide you control with his height and so forth. There is an argument, and I'm curious to get your thoughts about this. Ishant Sharma did play in this recent IPL. I would say, he's never really been a great white ball bowler. I mean, he had one IPL season, I think, a couple of years back where he looked somewhat decent. And this time out, too, he looked a little bit decent. Now, again, very different formats. Is there an argument to pick Ishant Sharma? I mean, I know they haven't gone with him, but would you have said that there is an argument to perhaps have picked Ishant Sharma as in this final sort of match and given him a one-off here at the Oval over, say, the options that have been picked? What are your thoughts about that? I just want to quickly get your thoughts about that. So, Sanket, over to you.
Yeah, so I think, and we can probably, this can be a good segue to the selection of the other senior player that we were going to talk about, Ajinkya Rahane's comeback, and like how, if Ajinkya Rahane can be recalled, why not Ishant Sharma? Well, I think there is, I think firstly there's a difference between a batter and a bowler in the sense that, Ishant Sharma, we don't really know about his fitness levels right now. He did play in the IPL, that's just 4 overs. So we don't know how good his fitness for first class cricket. I don't know if he played much in the Ranji Trophy this season, and if so, what were his numbers like? And ironically, the fact that he got picked in the IPL probably robbed him of the chance to play some county cricket, which would have been, I think, a better source for him to make his case for a test comeback. So yeah, I think if you purely ask me in terms of quality, like assuming that Ishant Sharma is fit enough to bowl 17, 18 overs in a day, then yeah, I think there's absolutely no doubt that even a somewhat declined version of Ishant Sharma is a safer option than any of the options that they have in the current squad, including probably Unadkat. I'm not as big a fan of Ishant Sharma as most, like in the sense that I think he had a very late resurgence to his career. Like he was, like not so good for almost a decade, and then when the pitches like started to become really bowler friendly, which we call the pace pandemic, like over the last like since 2017, 2018, he was unplayable for that period, like 2 to 3 years, maybe slightly longer than that, and then he's kind of lost touch again. So I think he's a bit of a, in that sense, you can probably call him a bit of a purple patch merchant, like someone who was very effective when the conditions were really friendly, whereas not quite, you know, the same bowler on flatter pitches. So I don't think like Ishan Sharma is going to be the difference between India winning or losing the World Test Championship, so to speak. Particularly the current version of Ishan Sharma, like 34, 35-year-old version, is definitely lost a bit of pace from where he was in 2018, 2019. But yeah, I think purely if you compare him to the options they have in the current squad, you've got Umesh Yadav who's got a similar age, he's also lost pace, he's got far less control than Ishan Sharma, even at his worst. And you got Shardul Thakur, whom I think there's enough has been documented about his, inconsistencies and lack of, control for a proper test bowler. And there's Unadkat, who I think is probably the safest option, like as we have all agreed on, out of the current lot. So maybe Unadkat versus Ishant, I think would be the only call if Ishant Sharma was in the squad. Which again, I'm not really sure which way I would lean. Maybe it would depend on how they would have been bowling in the nets, or their fitness and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I think if fit, then I would have probably had him in the squad, but I don't think it's a deal breaker.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
A little bit on the point you mentioned about India not grooming players to potentially bring in for this. I think it would be interesting to see how the next cycle goes, because I think the 2023-25 cycle will be the first one that isn't in some way scuffed by COVID. So it will be interesting to see how this the next WTC goes, with teams probably playing their full allotment of games every single time now. You aren't going to get series getting cut off early for some reason, or one series getting completed a year later. And we're probably also going to see a lot more A tours happening now as well, because traveling's a lot easier and it's not as expensive to send teams on A tours anymore. And I know India have plans for A tours to shadow the senior team for several of the tours they're going on already. So we could potentially see, by the time of the next WTC final, should India qualify again, they may be a little bit more confident in picking up a player who may be uncapped, but because they've been on A tours and shadowing the senior team for pretty much 2 whole years, they may feel that it's a lot easier to throw them into the fire, so to speak, for the WTC final in 2025 than here, where Arshdeep and Ishan Porel, they may have decent raw abilities, they may have done okay in Ranji, but they just don't have that top level experience yet. But if they've been playing on A tours, then you could perhaps make that argument that they're more ready to just take that baptism by fire and debut in a World Test Championship final.
Speaking of top level experience, the other, I guess, contentious selection in the squad, Rahane, been brought back, was famously dropped essentially after the South Africa tour. Shreyas Iyer took his place in the squad, but obviously Shreyas Iyer was injured. And so there are debates over whether he should have been called back for this one-off test match. His validity as a batsman, clearly he's been, in terms of runs accumulated, in decline of late in terms of consistency. He's always had, consistency issues to some degree after that initial start to his career, say around 2014, 2015-ish. But there is an argument, that you would need somebody like that. And there is an argument still posited, one that I tend to subscribe to some extent, that he is one of the best players of pace bowling even now in the Indian batting lineup. And so given that Australia have probably one of the best, if not the best, maybe South Africa have a better pace attack, all things considered, in the world, and they are going to be playing on a surface that may be on the quicker, bouncier side, there is an argument to recall Rahane in that regard. I know his form of late in England has been a bit poor, so there's also been debates about that. So where do you guys all place this? Do you feel the selection of Rahane made sense in your opinion? Do you think he should play? Do you think that him playing here would mean that he gets to play more tests going forward. What do you make of all this stuff?
Yeah. So I think talking about Rahane, I think again another selection which has been like drawn the ire of a lot of Indian fans. Firstly, I think you've got to, whenever you talk about a selection, you've got to analyze them vis-a-vis the replacements. So since Rahane and Pujara were both dropped after the South Africa tour, they tried Vihari. They tried Vihari for three tests, I think a couple against Sri Lanka and one against England. You could probably say that's not enough sample size like given, and he was dropped after that. But I think you have to take into consideration he played Test cricket before that as well. He's always seen as this overseas specialist, like someone who bats number six, who can probably save you a match, but not someone who's going to make big hundreds or win you Test matches. So he was seen as sort of a safety net kind of a player, not someone who's number three who can actually dominate Test matches and get big scores like Pujara has done. Pujara has won India Test series in Australia with 300s in series. Bihari is not quite in that class, so they brought Pujara back, rightly so in my opinion. And I think the same is with Rahane. They tried Shreyas Iyer, and I think if Shreyas Iyer was fit, he would have probably been picked ahead of him, which again I personally wouldn't have agreed with purely based on his vulnerabilities against the against the short pitch delivery, in conditions outside of the subcontinent. But even then, at least Shreyas Iyer has shown the spark required to be a Test cricketer in favorable conditions. You can probably still understand giving him a longer run because he's going to be a very vital player for you in at least at home. But now that he's out, who else do you go to? Do you debut someone like Sarfaraz Khan, who hasn't really lit up the stage even at the India A level? He's got a great first class record, but I think you've got to realize that this step up in class between Ranji Trophy and India A itself is massive, let alone the step up between India A and the senior national team level. So for someone to get picked purely based on Ranji Trophy performances, I think that would be a mistake unless he's shown he can do it at the India A level as well. So since he's supposedly the next cab of the rank, and we have seen people talk about the not mixing formats and all that, but I've seen Sarfaraz Khan literally fend for his life against fast bowlers, genuine fast bowlers in the IPL, like that, and it's not just his inability to hit fast bowling, the fact that he was actually taking his eyes off and is not able to even defend against it properly. Uh, so personally, I think that's a big red flag for me. So even though people are opinion that different formats are different, I personally still think that there is a baseline ability to play fast bowling, which remains true across the formats. So personally, for me, Sarfaraz Khan, from whatever I've seen of him, does not meet my eye test. Obviously, if he keeps performing at domestic level, you'd probably have to give him a go at certain point. But I don't think a one-off test in England against the likes of Cummins, Starc, and Hazelwood, Boland is the platform to do so. And the other option I think would have been Surya Kumar Yadav, who is again picked primarily on short form performances. It doesn't really have a particularly great first class record either. So if you're going to pick someone based on their short format record, like Rahane, people say that Rahane has been recalled based on his IPL performances. I think that's slightly inaccurate because I was listening to actually another podcast done by cricket.com guys. I think Nikhil Popat, who's a journalist at cricket.com, said that he has information that he had received from his sources or whatever, that Rahane had already been told to prepare for the red ball the moment Shreyas Iyer was ruled out. So this was even before he had played a single game for CSK in the IPL. The fact that he has actually gone on to do what he did in the IPL made I think his selection perhaps even easier, but it's not something that was out of the question even before he had played a single match for CSK. So that is there. So if you're picking between Rahane and Surya Kumar Yadav, why would you not go with someone who's actually shown the ability to play Test cricket in the past? He's got a Test 100 in England. Yes, his overall record in England is not the greatest, but again, if you look at his performances in some of the wins that India have had, he's played a key role in 3 out of the 4 matches that they've won since his debut in this country. The only match where he did not have any contribution was the win at this particular venue in 2018. Other than that, he's got 100 and 250 in the other 3 Test matches. His record at the Oval is not particularly great, but again, I think sample size of 3 tests, and also you've got to take into consideration the fact that his struggles in England have been against England, and he struggled mainly against Jimmy Anderson, who's absolutely tormented him. He's got an average of 10 or something like that against Jimmy Anderson. Whereas if you look at his record against the Australian fast bowlers, he is in fact only batsman in the Indian squad who averages 30 plus against each of the 3 Australian quicks, Starc, Cummins, and Hazelwood. Obviously, no one has played Scott Boland yet, apart from that one-off test that knocked out very hardly bowled, like 10 overs or something like that. So, but Rahane is the only batsman in the Indian squad with a good record or at least decent record against all three of the Australian quicks. So, even though that is in Australian conditions or in Indian conditions, that's still got to count for something. So, I think that should also be taken into consideration, not just his record against England, which is against a different kind of bowling attack and different line of attack. So I think his struggles, for me, more than England, are more related to his inability to play James Anderson. He struggled against Anderson even in India. So for me, I personally wouldn't pay too much heed to that.
I think some really good points there. The other factor is that you look at Rahane's performances and you go test by test, right? He has an ability that I've noticed, and I this is based off what I've seen from a large sample size and so forth. He tends to perform and score a lot. You brought up the 3 wins. A lot of the conditions where he has scored hundreds, even in recent times when he's been inconsistent or 50s or so forth, have been in not particularly friendly conditions for that, and against better quality bowling lineups a lot of the time. And I think that you have to consider that, right? Because looking at a match, overall aggregate, right, can be a little bit misleading in those circumstances, right? Again, conditions where somebody actually scores those runs and how they score them is often very critical, right? Very important as well. So I think that's a facet you have to consider as well. Stuff, your thoughts about the Rahane pick?
Yeah, like I was saying before, this is a one-off, very crucial game, and it's hard to justify throwing in a debutant into that environment. So Rahane is here almost because India don't really have any other options. And again, on before, like what I was saying before about if India had more A-team games in the past couple of years, and they'd had people who performed a lot in those games in a variety of conditions, maybe even on a tour of England against the England Lions, then you could justify picking Sarfraz Khan or Suryakumar Yadav or someone else for the final. You could justify that they have enough experience at this level or a similar level to debut in these conditions. But I don't think there's anybody in India who could right now. So India have fallen back to the safe option of Rahane, a very experienced player. I think he's played over 100 tests as well at this point. And even though he's been in poor form, 82, okay, so almost there. Even though he's been in poor form for the last couple of years, it feels like a terminal decline. He's still just the safe pick, and I think for a final like this, you can't go too wrong with the safe pick. I know people will say like, "Oh, Suryakumar Yadav would have scored a century in these conditions," but like, he's never played a test match before, so it's really hard to conflate what he's been doing domestically in the IPL in different formats and not in England against a bowling attack of the quality of Australia. It's hard to conflate that with how he would hypothetically do in a big final like this, in this specific environment.
And he has a technique that is more, I would say, personally suited towards the shorter format, right? I think his defensive capabilities are a little bit on the weaker side, to be very blunt. As a matter of fact, you look at his ODI average, he averages, 25 now? And granted, he did play on some surfaces recently against Australia in that ODI series that weren't exactly conducive to the bat and got some jaffas. But the point is that, in the longer, even if you want to look at the longer format, right, of the game, T20 is the shortest format. ODIs are a longer format. ODIs probably have a little bit more of a barometer from just in terms of, your ability of your testing your defensive technique, I would say, than the T20 format. And the results haven't been good there either. So I tend to agree with you. I mean, he did play that one-off game, in India, where he only scored 8. Granted, can't read too much into that, but I do genuinely think that Rahane, like with you guys, I tend to agree. Rahane is probably the safest bet at hand, and I think it makes sense for the team selection to be oriented that way. With that said, let's turn our attention now to Australia and look at the sort of selection debates they're having, right? We are in a moment where it's kind of interesting for Australia because they have a guy who's been playing a couple of matches with them who has figures that would be probably more akin to what you would see in a bowler from the 19th century in Scott Boland, a ridiculous average of what is it, 15 or something with the ball, and he's performed so well, including in that one-off game. I know Sanket, you mentioned he didn't bowl too many runs, but he basically went for 0 runs, or went for one run and over, something like that in that game. He bowled very dry spell in that first test, I believe it was, and so there is suggestions from the camp that Boland will be the front runner for the attack that's going to be assembled at the Oval from the Australian standpoint. There are also questions on whether Starc plays. He doesn't have necessarily the best record in England. Again, I don't like looking at countrywide records because they don't actually tell you about how a certain player played in on the respective pitches, and I think that's a far more important consideration. But there are concerns that Starc may not be the best fit for the attack if you do get conditions that are more stereotypically conducive to bowlers who can seam it around a bit more. So where do you guys stand with that? Starc, Hazelwood, Boland. Out of the three, which two do you guys choose? What are your thoughts? Sanket?
Yeah. So I think regarding Starc, I think firstly, I think what is going to happen is I don't think Starc's place realistically is under any threat from the team management. So I think for them it's a straight call between Hazelwood and Boland. Whether he should play or not, I think more than his record in England, I think what is more concerning is his record against India, be it in India or in Australia. Obviously, is easily been the worst bowler, like the seam bowler on either side over the last couple of Border Gavaskar trophies in Australian conditions, and is pretty much every single Indian batter averages over 50 against him. Like some of them average like in the hundreds, 200s against him. So pretty much just had the wood over him, but they pretty much completely crushed and like tormented
Some
him.
even average infinity over him because they've never been dismissed by him.
Yeah. So that is, I think, the bigger concern, because I think as far as his ability to bowl in English conditions is concerned, I think he seems to be getting his swing back. Like we saw in the ODI series against India, he was swinging the ball back into the right-hander, which is something that we've not seen from him for a long period of time. He was getting the ball to reverse considerably in Pakistan. He bowled really well in Sri Lanka, but again when it came to India in that test at Ahmedabad, he lost his rhythm. And against the Indian batters who are far more equipped against the pace bowling than Pakistani and Sri Lankan batters, he lost his way. Obviously, that's different conditions that I'm talking about. I'm talking about subcontinental conditions here, but I think that also says a little bit about his tendency to lose the plot against batters who don't just get bullied by raw pace. Like against Pakistan, a lot of the wickets that he got, were because the batsmen were probably too late to react to his high pace, whereas that is not going to be the case with India, because they can handle pace. He has to beat them more with his skill rather than just the raw pace. So that is, I think, a big disadvantage for him when it comes to playing against India. In England, I think if conditions do seem around, I think is improved in his global seam delivery that he has developed, I think, over the last 18 months or so. So I don't think he's got an English conditions issue specifically as of now. Although obviously if the matches are low scoring, then the general rule of thumb is that you would want a bowler who's got more control, because the runs are at a premium, so you don't want someone who's conceding 4.5 runs and over. So that obviously goes against him. But other than that, he was quite impressive in that home Ashes against England, which was quite a low scoring series. So I'm more less concerned about that, more concerned about his ability to bowl to certain batters, and and basically whether he can keep the lid on the run scoring if things do not go his way. And that, I think, leads me to the other point. Like if Starc is going to be in the 11, which I think is inevitable, because he has been Australia's most used seamer over this WTC cycle. He's played more tests than even Cummins. And I think what Andrew McDonald said is that they basically see this WTC final as a reward for the players who basically contributed towards Australia getting there in the first place. So using that logic, I think Starc is definitely a certainty. And in general, I think this team management under Pat Cummins' captaincy probably have more faith in Starc than maybe the previous team management did. Uh, whether rightly or wrongly, I think we'll probably know by the end of this tour, because in the last tour of England, he played only one test. And Australia did win that test. Overall, you can say that it was a reasonably successful move, because the bowlers that were picked in his absence did a reasonably good job. You can always debate about what would have happened at Headingley if Stark had played. That's again a debate that will rage on. But overall, a 2-2 draw at the start of the series, Australia would have probably taken that. So it did work. But now I think they are looking at him as a lead bowler, someone who's going to play all the tests as long as he's fit. Uh, so I think the proof, as they say, will be in the pudding when the tests happen. And eventually, if he doesn't bowl well, whether they have that flexibility to drop him, or whether Pat Cummins doesn't have it in him to drop a close friend. But I think that is for a later date. For the first test of the tour, not the series, because the Ashes obviously happens later. But basically, first of the 6 tests, effectively back to back, I do not see him being dropped. He will be picked. So then it comes down to the choice between the other two. And since you got Mitchell Starc in the attack, who already we know as a volatile bowler, you got Pat Cummins, obviously the best in the world. Then you got Cameron Green, who's still a bit of a greenhorn, no pun intended, when it comes to bowling at the test level. And then you got Nathan Lyon, who had a brilliant series against India in India, but his most recent series against India outside of the subcontinent, which was in Australia in 2021, did not go particularly well. Indian batsmen seem to have had the measure of him in conditions which were not quite spin friendly, and we saw that even in the even in the series in India, on the pitches that were not quite as spin friendly, other than the indoor test, the Delhi test, India were able to negotiate him reasonably successfully. So when you have that composition of an attack, who is going to be your third single, I think becomes very important. And I think in that case, I think Scott Boland's reliability and his durability becomes very important, because pick Josh Hazelwood, and we know that Josh Hazelwood does not have a particularly good fitness record for completing test matches. He's broken down midway through the test twice the last couple of home summers, Brisbane against West Indies, and before that against England as well. He's not hardly played any test cricket in this cycle of the WTC. He missed the tour of India as well. He missed half of this IPL, and then played a few matches, then again pulled out, apparently due to some injury concern, which was not a concern. But overall, I think safe to say that there are multiple concerns over Josh Hazelwood's durability as a test match bowler, as first class bowler at the moment. And again, going by what McDonald said about the team being picked on the basis of whoever has contributed to them being in the final in the first place, I think Scott Boland has undoubtedly featured more in this WTC final than Josh Hazelwood has. So when you look at the composition of the attack, you've got Starc, who's somewhat unreliable. You've got Green, who's still relatively new. You've got Lyon, who as a spinner might not necessarily be particularly effective in England if the pitches don't turn. So then you've only really got Cummins as a banker. If Hazelwood is the other bowler in your attack and he breaks down midway through the test, then I think Cummins will have to do a lot of heavy lifting. With Boland, I think you've got certainty, someone who's extremely durable, terrific fitness, someone who can bowl long spells, which means that Cummins can probably operate in shorter bursts rather than being the workhorse. He can be used more as an attacking option. And also another thing is that Scott Boland tends to prefer bowling first change, which means Cummins can then take the new ball where he's even more effective than he has been, first change, which we saw even in the last tour of England, where he ran through them in the second innings at Old Trafford when he took the new ball. So that's again, I think, another thing to consider, that Scott Boland does allow Pat Cummins to take the new ball. So when you consider all these things, I think Scott Boland over Josh Hazelwood is a fairly straightforward pick as far as I'm concerned. If Josh Hazelwood was fit, then I think there would be a case, in my opinion, not so much in the opinion of the team management, for Hazelwood possibly play over Starc, or maybe even Lyon if the conditions were like what we talk about as the typical English conditions, early summer, which we had for the last WTC. But again, that doesn't seem to be the case this time around. So I don't think there is any point speculating on that. So yeah.
I think that's really well put. And yeah, I think that given the fitness issues, see, for me, I think it's also the factor that I think Hazelwood has been a very very good bowler for Australia in general, and I think the emphasis is going to be to try to prolong his career. And I think if you try to rush him in when he's not been fit of late, and you don't fully let him sort of rehabilitate from any of these injuries, or give him the adequate amount of rest, you run the risk of actually sort of ending his career prematurely. And it kind of reminds me actually of Jason Gillespie for that matter, right? Jason Gillespie was the sort of gun seamer that partnered with McGrath. This generation's McGrath, you could say, is Cummins. That generation, even though Hazelwood more in style operates like McGrath, you would say that Hazelwood, in terms of quality, is sort of the Gillespie, I would argue, to you know uh, in that, if you're comparing the two attacks and trying to put a lace together. And there was an issue with Gillespie where he was struggling with fitness and injury issues, and it affected him, right? The zip on his bowling, so called, even though his pace was still pretty decent, he wasn't able to really get the ball to move as much, and he was having issues with fitness, and that was brutally exposed in come the 2005 Ashes cycle, and that really hastened his decline from the team, and it affected Australia in that series, that very critical series for them. So I agree with you, Sanket. I think that for the benefit of the Australian team going forward, and especially for the benefit of all things considered, for the factors you mentioned, I do think Boland should probably make the cut, along with Starc and Cummins, and then Green gives you that fourth bowling option, and then obviously you have Lyon as your frontline spinner. Now, what is interesting to me, right, is the conception at hand of the possibility that Australia have a second spinner if the conditions, come fourth innings or something, turn a lot. They do have an option of a second bowling option. I mean, they haven't used him much of late, but they use him against the West Indies and so forth. There is an argument to make a little bit more use of Travis Head, the spinner, if those conditions happen, where they are playing, say, and there is wear and tear on the wicket, or there is a little bit more turn and so forth. But for me, what's more interesting is this debate that's raging on of late with Warner and his sort of conditions aside, whether he makes it in the opening spot, and then if he does make it in the opening spot, where does Travis Head play? Because Travis Head was promoted up the order when Warner wasn't playing in India for a bit, and he actually fared pretty well given all those circumstances. So where do you see the role of Travis Head in the side evolving? Does he also, for this game, does he adopt the sort of aggressive approach that he's been using of late, and playing some real blinders of knocks at hand on difficult batting conditions? Does he try to assume a little bit more of a restrained role, given the nature of the contest at hand, and also given maybe if the pitch is not as bowler friendly that necessitates taking those risks? Where do you see his position in the side being? Navan, over to you.
Yeah, I think Head will probably end up playing in the lower order, in the lower middle order, and I think he'll probably be told to play that sort of blinder hitter role to try and take the game away from India. That might change if he comes in at 30 for 4 or something. But if he comes in at a reasonable total, then I think the expectation will be to play like he's been playing recently, and not try and change anything up too much just because it's a big final. Because that's worked in the very recent past for him. It's been his most successful stretch of Test cricket is playing like this. So I don't think they'll ask him to try and change up his style too much just for this game. Now, a lot might change again for the next cycle, and I feel like I'm talking about the next cycle a bit too much for this final, but I feel like it is important to emphasize that I feel like both teams are going to approach this as the ending of the previous cycle, and if they want to make any changes, they're going to start that with the next series. For this specific match, I think they're just going to try and stick with what's worked for the past 2 years, and for Head, that's been playing these blinder innings, and if they want to try something else, that's going to have to wait for the Ashes instead.
I think that's fair, and it has to be mentioned, right? Travis Head has played some phenomenal innings past, I would say 24 months. Really, I mean, really since his induction. I'm trying to remember exactly when that was. But against South Africa on that very difficult pitch, him scoring that 90 odd and really taking on that bowling attack. I know Rabada wasn't particularly bowling well that day, but still, there's just been a bunch of innings, even in India where he made that, that 40 odd. Was it Indore and stuff? There's just been a bunch of innings, even against in the Ashes in England for that matter. When he scored that 100, right, on a green top at Hobart, right, which was a proper green top. It wasn't particularly bouncy, but it was still a green top. And I know England again bowled poorly that day. Vokes in particular was a culprit, but it's just been one of the situations where the amount of performances that he's put in on pitches which you wouldn't expect batsmen to be able to score in that fashion, right, have really been phenomenal. So I think he's a very important player in the setup, and especially with Warner's struggles and concerns, lately, him, just announcing actually recently that he's looking to retire during the Pakistan series after the Ashes at home in 2024. There is a genuine concern that if Australia are gonna constantly get to what you would call not so great starts, right, where both their openers sort of fall relatively cheaply, or one of them falls cheaply, and there are inroads. You need somebody like Head to arrest that decline and really play some very aggressive innings, especially to give his side time to bowl out better batting lineups, right? So I think that's a really important facet, right? And I think that the other factor that we sort of need to take into look in consideration now is actually the keepers, and the keepers actually from both sides, as a matter of fact, right? That Carey has had a interesting time, I would say, currently as the in-choice replacement of Tim Paine after Tim Paine is retired and really left scene after his intermediate role of sort of controlling Australia during the middle of part of the language shit show. So I do think he's been a decent keeper for what it's considered, and with the bat, especially at home, he's been fairly decent. I do think he's had problems, however, in this recent India series. We alluded to it a little bit earlier, but he has really struggled big time against Ashwin. The reverse sweeps only having a semblance of usefulness in that regard. So there is a question if this is sort of, he's also a very old player comparatively speaking, right? He really only made his professional, his foray into even first class cricket, for that matter, consistent, because he had I think it was a debate between him and then AFL or something to that effect. He was involved in another sport, and he sort of didn't quite choose cricket till much later in the process. So he's not a particularly young fellow. I don't remember his exact age. I'd love if you guys could chime in about that, but I know he's
31.
31. Okay, so he's not as old as I thought he was, but at the same point, he's still not a particularly young fellow, right? And there are debates on whether, with the presence of some other options that I know in the domestic setup that are coming through the ranks of the wicketkeepers, does he like, how important is this match for him in terms of securing his standing for stuff the next cycle, and for that matter even going forward? And then the other debate that's been raging is KS Bharat, who's the selected keeper at the moment, right? Does he, this is from the India side now, does he make it into the setup after what was a bit of an indifferent series at home, I would say, on some admittedly tough pitches, or does Kishan come in as the replacement? So I want you guys to chime in on both of those thoughts, and starting with you, Sanket.
Yeah, so I think firstly, talking about Alex Carey, firstly, I think specifically when you talk about in a tactical sense, with Alex Carey in the side of Australia, we've got 4 left-handers in the top 7. And if Ashwin plays for India, then again, that's obviously something that he will fancy. We've got Mohammad Siraj as well, who again, someone who prefers bowling to left-handers compared to right-handers. Mohammad Shami is pretty good against both. So that is one factor. Secondly, I think Alex Carey is, as you pointed out, he's already 31. He'll be turning 32 in August. So he's not exactly spring chicken. So he's not. He doesn't really seem to be a player who's got a lot of upside when you think of it. His first class average is okay. It's not nothing extraordinary. He's got a first class average of 33, 33.59, so 34. His test average is 31 after 19 test matches. So that's a reasonably decent sample size. I mean, players get dropped after far less games in this day and age. So 19 test matches, 31. You know, and other than this Indian tour, the recent Indian series, and maybe a couple of tests against England at home, they've been in reasonably decent batting conditions. Like he played in Pakistan, then he played against West Indies at home, which was pretty good batting conditions. South Africa series, other than the Brisbane Test, was also played in pretty good batting conditions. So it's not like he's been playing all his matches in rank turners or green tops. So that's another thing. And when you compare him with his most immediate like successor, or the alternative right now, the guy who's basically the alternative in this current squad is Josh Inglis, is 5 years younger to him. He's got a similar first class record. He's a much better keeper. Alex Carey's keeping has been a point of contention in the past, although I think he was very impressive on the recent India tour with the gloves, not so much in front of it, but behind the stumps. He was, I think, pretty much faultless on difficult pitches. But
I'd agree.
I think more his keeping concerns have probably been more against the seamers standing back. So I think in that sense, this England tour will probably test him more than a subcontinental tour, because his keeping in Australian conditions has been suspect against the faster bowlers. And obviously, England, if you're not comfortable keeping against quicks, then England is possibly the worst place to be as a wicketkeeper. Like we've seen, even MS Dhoni, one of the great wicketkeepers, like extraordinary wicketkeeper in subcontinental conditions. Even he's had his issues with the wobbling seam delivery in England as a keeper on multiple tours. So that's, I think, another going to be a big test for Alex Carey behind the stumps. His batting has not been particularly impressive. His technique against the moving ball, I think, leaves a lot to be desired. Tends to play away from his body. He's supposed to be a good player. Has been had a good initiation to his test career in the subcontinental with those tours of Pakistan and Sri Lanka, but then we saw what happened against Ravichandran Ashwin. So they'll be up against him. So that's going to be another big challenge. And yeah, I mean, I think the fact that they picked the squad only for the first couple of test matches for the Ashes does indicate that there are a lot of players. I think people have they talked about this in the context of David Warner, like that he's probably going to get this test and maybe the first couple of Ashes tests, and if it doesn't work out, that's going to be it for him in Test cricket. I think Alex Carey is probably another guy who's possibly in a similar boat, because again, but they've got a replacement on hand. He's a right-hander who brings, I think, probably a bit more variety in the batting lineup. Although again, it would be 4 right-handers and 3 left-handers as opposed to 4 left-handers and 3 right-handers. So probably not a big deal in that sense. But generally, most teams consist of more right-handers than left-handers. So in that sense, the lineup would seem probably relatively more balanced, especially against a team like India. Although he's not going to play against India anyways, because Carey is going to get the first steps. But in general, that is possibly another thing to consider, that Josh Inglis brings a bit of right-handedness to the batting lineup. And he's, as I said, he's a much better keeper. He's younger. He's got a higher upside. There are others. There are other options as well in domestic cricket. Jimmy Pearson has been doing really well in Sheffield Shield, and even on A tours, like he scored 100 in Sri Lanka. In the 4th innings to win a test for Australia last year. Despite that, he did not quite get a look in on the tour of India, even in the squad, which is a little bit of a surprise. And he's still not in the mix. But again, there are options. Like Australia are not really, lacking options in the wicket-keeping department as compared to, say, India, that we will talk about, like when we discuss the KS versus Kishan debate about how they probably don't have the greatest of depth behind Rishabh Pant. Whereas with Australia don't have a Rishabh Pant in the sense that they don't have any outstanding first choice. But I do think the backups in that sense are probably a little bit better than India's, or at least I think there is a more persuasive case for not giving Alex Carey a longer rope than, say, someone like a KS Bharat if he were to falter, because I think he's already had a decent run anyway. So yeah, I think he'll definitely play this test, and I think even if he fails, uh, I think he'll definitely get the first couple of tests in the Ashes, as will David Warner. Because although, in my opinion, if you ask me, I think Warner just really should wait for Warner. I don't think he really should be playing a test in England against England, uh, based on his past history and his age as well. But I think we all know that, you know, unfortunately, it's how selections happen in cricket. Changes do not happen unless the team loses. So I do not expect Australia to lose this test. Obviously, we'll be doing the predictions later, but assuming, assuming, that, assuming that Australia do win this test, even if David Warner gets a king pair in this test, and even if Alex Carey gets a king pair in this test, I do not expect either of them to be dropped for the first test at Edgbaston. And maybe if they fail again and Australia go behind in the Ashes, then maybe you might expect reactions then, but not immediately.
Fair enough. And now, stuff regarding the other facet, right, from the Indian perspective, right? KS Bharat versus Kishan. I have thoughts that are not exactly the most how do I put it? The most gentle regarding this debate, but uh, I want you to chime in a little bit here and see what you have to say.
Yeah, so as I've said repeatedly, you just can't throw in a debutant, especially one without much first-class A-team experience, into this final like this. So I would pick Bharat, even though he hasn't been the most convincing with the bat, and his keeping has been all right. Nothing incredible to write home about. He hasn't been disastrous either. So I think you just go with the safer pick. That would be KS Bharat. Again, after this final is when you maybe try more experimental picks. But as Sanket was saying earlier, India don't really have the best depth at wicketkeeper, and Rishabh Pant's unfortunate car accident has sort of thrown India for a huge loop right now. I mean, it says a lot when India's second choice keeper until May for this match was KL Rahul, who's not the most convincing wicketkeeper. That sort of tells you where India's wicketkeeping stocks are right now. But yeah, for this game, you probably just go with the safe option of Bharat. And Kishan, he's done a lot in the other formats recently, but not enough in first-class cricket for me to want to risk this.
I think it's a fair point. I know Ricky Ponting, was of the opinion that they should play both Surya Kumar Yadav and Ishan Kishan, which I don't know if that was made, to be quite frank, in full seriousness, or that was maybe just an egg on to be like, hey, maybe you should play against Australia, two players that are probably not going to do so well. And speaking of which, I'll make my opinion very clear about Kishan. I don't think he's an international class test batsman. I think there's cases for him as a white ball player. As I'm talking about currently, obviously things can change, but I think he is painfully limited the moment the ball moves in any direction. Whether it be off the deck from the paces, away, in the air from the paces, it spins for that matter. I think the biggest use case for Ishan Kishan is if the pitch is flat and there are bowling attacks that are willing to essentially, or that are having a bit of an off day. I think he can gun down players in that respect. I actually don't think his keeping is too bad, as a matter of fact. I've seen it for a while now. I think his foot movements to get behind the ball are fairly decent, right? Even still, I do think Bharat is the better keeper of the two. I know he had a bad series, a relatively bad series, I would say, and he was outshone by Carey in India recently. But I would argue that two of those surfaces, right, or actually a couple of those surfaces, were not the easiest to keep on. I'm thinking of Delhi, especially, and then Indore, as a matter of fact. Even Nagpur, there was the odd ball that clearly ripped. So I don't think that it's necessarily analogous to what you'd probably see here in England. I do think Bharat is also, the argument that I've seen positive for Kishan is that he is a better player of pace when the ball isn't moving than Bharat. But even in that series that we just saw, right, when Bharat really took the Cameron Green to the cleaners. I know it wasn't a surface that was particularly useful, but I think it was in the fourth test where he took Cameron Green to the cleaners. He tried to bowl short, and and he hammered him a little bit. And I've noticed that Bharat is one of the few domestic players in India who's a bit weird in that he plays pace a lot better than spin. Um, and so I think that that logic is definitely there. Sanket, I know you have some thoughts about this as well. What are your thoughts in this regard?
Yeah. So again, I think I pretty much, if you had asked me this like a few days back, I would pretty much be in the like in complete agreement with both of you that I think it's a no-brainer that KS Bharat should be playing ahead of Ishan Kishan. And if you ask me probably which way I would lean, I think I would still probably say that way. But I do think there is a persuasive case for Kishan, which I have been more convinced on than I was in the past. Basically, again, listening to another podcast that I was listening to, and I think what I think is particularly pertinent here is the record of the Australian fast bowlers against left-handers vis-a-vis right-handers. You've got Pat Cummins in the over the last couple of years. The average is 30.4 something against left-handers and 19 against right-handers. You've got Josh Hazelwood, who probably wouldn't play this test, but it's very similar, like 21, 22 against the right-handers and 30, 32 against the left-handers. Mitchell Starc is probably somewhat similar. And you've got Scott Boland, who averages 12 against the right-handers. I've not really checked against his numbers against left-handers, but I'm going to assume they're not better than that. So you've got an attack wherein almost every single fast bowler prefers bowling to right-handers to left-handers. If you look at India's success in Test cricket in recent times, a lot of them has come through the left-handers scoring runs, be it Rishabh Pant, be it Ravindra Jadeja, or be it Washington Sundar in that test at the Gabba, or be it Akshar Patel in the recent home series. Like the left-handedness that they've had in the batting lineup has helped them like to tackle certain matchups. Like Jadeja actually has a very good record against like most of the Australian seamers because they don't particularly enjoy bowling to left-handers. So purely on the basis of that, given that there is not much to choose between Kishan and Bharat in terms of quality, like both of them are very similar first-class averages. Kishan is a bit younger, so that's another factor in his favor that you've got someone who's younger and possibly has a higher upside in the future. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. Like as I said, I don't think there is a big difference in their keeping abilities, as you pointed out. I think Kishan was relatively safe in this IPL, a different format, obviously, but I don't think his keeping is bad. Like if India were probably open to KL Rahul keeping wickets if he was fit, then I think he would have probably kept wicket in this World Test Championship. So Kishan is definitely a better keeper than him. So I don't think that his keeping should rule him out of selection. And given the fact that there is not much of a difference in terms of quality between Kishan and Bharat, why not go for the guy who gives you a different option? Like your entire batting lineup is right-handed, so why not just throw a left-hander in there? They only really have Jadeja right now, so maybe 5 and 2 would be a better balance than 6 and 1 in the top 7. So that I think is just playing the devil's advocate here. I'm not saying that is what I would necessarily do because you know there is Ishan Kishan hasn't really done anything extraordinary to unseat KS Bharat, who was the incumbent. So KS Bharat is not great, but he was not terrible in the series. The most recent test at Ahmedabad, he did score some runs. So purely, if you're going by the most recent test, then he ought to get another chance based on that. And Kishan hasn't really done anything extraordinary to unseat him. So that's the other side of the argument. I don't necessarily buy the debutant part because again, we're not. It's not like we're debating Rahane versus Sarfaraz Khan here because we're talking about Rahane who's got played 85 Test matches, 3 tours of England, versus a guy who's a complete debutant. That's not the case here. KS Bharat himself has played only 4 Test matches and none of it outside the subcontinent. So it's basically between two greenhorns. So I don't think that's a particularly persuasive argument in KS Bharat's favor. I think the argument would be more of incumbency and sticking with the process and basically because Kishan has not done anything to force his way in. But yeah, I think if they do, as I said, I think I see the argument both ways. I think this is a genuine toss-up, and I personally wouldn't begrudge them whichever way they.
Whichever way they go. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's a point that I didn't think about, right? The left-handed aspect of it. But yeah, that does make sense, right? And I could see them, punting for that, especially because I do also feel that they value Kishan's ability to, score rather aggressively in other formats, and they might perceive that, translating even to like first class level. I know he has a fairly decent strike rate in Ranji, for example, And so I think they might think that could translate to the test side or and so forth. So like you make some really good points there. For me, I guess it's also just the fact that the dot ball percentage of Kishan, right? Across formats that I've seen, right? When I a friend of the show, Gurkha Singhil, who I think we're all familiar with, he had made the point once that when Kishan gets stuck, he gets stuck really bad, right? And I think that for me, probably tips the scales towards Bharat in that specific case, as well, because I don't think Bharat is as bad as strike rotation as Kishan. But like you're saying, right, there are actually like legitimate arguments I think that are very reasonable as to why they might punt for Kishan. So I think that's a pretty good point. Now, Sanket, you already kind of pointed out what you felt about this, but let's jump into predictions, right? And let's jump into who do we think is going to win this particular test and why? And I'll chime in a little bit here first, and just say that I think that like I'm in the case of what Sanket's mentioned here, I do feel that Australia is probably going to win this test. I do think they have the stronger bowling lineup, and that's a major consideration. I also think that in general there is going to be the factor to consider that I think that Nathan Lyon on surfaces. I know you mentioned earlier that when the surfaces aren't as conducive to spin, he can struggle in England, Sanket. But I think part of it also is more that when the surfaces are slower and lower, I think he tends to struggle more. I think he feeds off bounce, and I think he would be a more potent strike weapon than the likes of Ashwin or Jadeja when there is more bounce in the wicket. And if expectations of the Oval are that it'll have reasonable pace of bounce, if not more than that, I think he could be a trump card in that respect. I know he hasn't had the greatest of series in Australia against India, like you mentioned. I do think that part of that does stem down to the fact that there have been players who I think who handled him very well, that are not necessarily playing in the series. For example, when the first time the Border Gavaskar Trophy happened and India won, I think they were indebted in part to Mayank Agarwal stepping down the track and really playing, Lyon very well. Pujara was also in much better form then. I know he's made a comeback. I know he's done fairly decent, but I do think there has been a reduction in his ability to play spin as of late. Even though this recent series he's done fairly okay, you would say. And in Bangladesh he scored that 100. I still feel that there's just aspects where I don't think he's the Pujara of old. I don't think he gets down to the pitch as easily. I think his interception points are not as solid as they once were. And I think that there are weaknesses in this Indian batting lineup. I know Kohli just scored that big 100 in Ahmedabad, and I know that he's been in very good form of late in the IPL. But I still have reservations on whether he'll necessarily do that well in the circumstances provided. The other thing I'd spring a surprise here maybe and say, I know Starc, there's been concerns of him, and like we've addressed earlier. But the thing that I noticed in the Ashes was that, especially in that Adelaide, which, if you guys recall, was not a particularly, it didn't really offer much in terms of movement for the seamers. It was mostly a flat wicket with a hint of bounce in it that was on the slightly slower side. And I know it was a pink ball test, but he took 7 wickets in that game, and he largely took them seaming the ball off the deck. And I thought his length was, a more consistent, goodish length than it often is. With Starc, there's often this fear that he sprays it sometimes, but more than even spraying it, his length is sort of almost like ODI-esque, right? To say that he goes searching for wickets in that full length, which I don't think is a bad strategy when the ball's new, but I think often with Starc, it's sort of like more of a Yorker bouncer kind of dichotomy. Not necessarily that he bowls those two deliveries more often, but like the lengths are a lot more variegated in that respect, rather than him hitting a good length, even a foolish good length, a lot of the time. And I think that that test was evidence that he can bowl that way. In Pakistan, you mentioned it, Sanket, a little bit earlier. People talk about the reverse swinging capabilities that he has, but I think there's also a factor of him developing his game where he's bowling in that series, especially. He bowled a lot more cutters, and I think that fastest cutters can also be very useful, especially when if the pitch is deteriorating to some degree in the fourth innings with his sort of height on off. He doesn't have the highest release point, but he has a high enough where that could cause problems, especially if he's bowling it a little bit quicker. So I think he might play a bigger role than people anticipate. So those are my predictions for this match in total. But I'm curious, Stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go for Australia as well. I just think Australia is slightly more prepared for this than India are. I think they've been in England for a little bit longer. They've been playing some county teams to try and get that multi-day practice. India, meanwhile, most of the team have just come straight from the IPL. A few of them came a couple weeks earlier because their teams didn't, or a couple days early because their team didn't make the playoffs. But still, I feel like they've been a little bit too fractured in their preparation compared to Australia. Now, I firmly believe for any type of cricket, the best way to practice for playing the team sport of cricket is to play together as a team. I think like the best example of this was the T20, but for the 2021 T20 World Cup, I think the best preparation for teams was to play international T20s with each other instead of playing in the IPL in the UAE right before, because you prepare different roles if you're playing a different team. And because of that, I feel like Australia have just come into this slightly more prepared than India has. And on top of that, they have the better bowlers, as you mentioned. They have a slightly more reliable batting lineup, man for man, than India do. Not to say India's batting lineup is bad, but I feel like a few of those players are just in too much of a inconsistent spot right now compared to Australia's. And I think Australia's team composition is just slightly more suited for the type of pitch to expect than India's is. As you said, Starc is he's a very hot and cold bowler, and if he blows hot, then India will definitely be in a lot of trouble. But I feel like Australia are much better prepared for Starc having an off game than India are if one of their key bowlers ends up having a poor game. Just with the rest of Australia's attack being a bit more reliable than India's is, and being a bit better prepared to fill in the gaps that a non-performing Starc might leave, compared to where India would be if Shami or Siraj, for example, has a bad game. And yeah, of course, it's a one-off game. Anything can happen, really. That's sort of the magic of this game being a one-off game and not a three-match series like some have been suggesting. And I prefer the WCC final to be a one-off game because I feel like it's supposed to be the ending of the 2-year cycle as opposed to a series that'll stand alone in its own right. So yeah, I think Australia are more prepared to win this game, but again, I wouldn't entirely discount India.
Sanket, what about you?
Yeah. So I think I was just thinking of this, and even though the bookies probably have this game as more even than what many of us think, even though I think most cricket analysts or experts or websites would probably have predicted an Australian win. The bookies have Australia as 49, 34, 17 kind of situation. So I was just thinking of drawing some parallels with the GABA test, which is regarded as the biggest miracle, like probably the biggest upset in the history of Indian Test cricket. So just drawing some parallels to that. So if you just compare the Indian side from that test to now, you look at the man for man, only real big upgrade from the 11 that played at the Gabba to now is Mohammad Shami. You got Siraj, who had played that test, is playing now. You might say he's a better bowler or he's improved since then. I'm not necessarily sure. I actually think the best that he bowled in Test cricket was in that debut series. He's probably regressed a bit since then.
I think
you got Jadeja Unadkat instead of Natarajan. Probably a slight upgrade, but Natarajan bowled all right at that test. I'm not sure if Unadkat will be able to replicate that. You got Washington. You had Washington Sundar as a spinner in that game. You now have Jadeja. So that is again another big upgrade. But again, how much of a role does spin will have in England remains to be seen. So he could be, if he's just having a restrictive role as a containing bowler, then it's very similar to what Sundar managed last time around as well. and then you probably have Shardul Thakur. I do think that India will probably go in with Shardul Thakur over Ashwin, purely on the basis of the past history of them winning in England with four seamers and then losing the last WTC final with the two spinners. I just think that will play in the back of their minds, and they'll probably go in with Shardul over Ashwin, which is, even though I think all of us disagree on that, but I think that is what is likely to happen. So you had Shardul then, was a bit of an unknown factor. Now everyone knows what he does, and his luck seems to have tapered off a little bit compared to what he started off. So again, I
I'll
think I would
just say
say,
I still don't know what he does to
yeah.
get. But sorry, go ahead.
So I think if you look at the bowling attack, the only upgrade is Mohammad Shami. Like everyone else is either the same or is probably deteriorated compared to what they were at the gap. So in that sense, their attack, like if we talk about their attack at the gap, was seen as this weak attack with the underdogs who managed to conjure up that miracle. But their attack even now isn't much better in the absence of Mohammad. Apart from obviously the big upgrade of Mohammad Shami compared to say Navdeep Sain who played in that test. Now if you look at the batting lineup, you don't have a Rishabh Pant, which is a huge downgrade. You got Rohit Sharma, slightly older Rohit Sharma compared to 2021 when he was at his peak. You got Shubman Gill, who was on debut back then, had a great series. Now it's very debatable whether you think Gill is a better player now than he was then. I think he is probably a better player, but also teams know him better. In that series, Australia kept bowling short to him because they didn't really know what his weaknesses were, and he absolutely pummeled them. Now, the likes of James Anderson and Kyle Jamieson have shown the way on what you need to do against Gill. So Team Australia might be better prepared for him this time around than they were for him in 2021. Although his form, in the IPL has been absolutely incredible. So who knows, he might just come out last year. So I think I would say Gill is a bit of a question mark whether he was better in 2021 or better now. I think Rohit was definitely better in 2021. You got Pujara, who was, again, I think definitely better back then. You got Kohli, as opposed to Mayank Agarwal, who played in that test. So that is, again, I would say a significant upgrade, even though Kohli might not be at his best, but he's still a much better player than Mayank Agarwal. And then you've got Rahane. Again, I don't know what to say about this because he's not played any red ball cricket since he was dropped from the test side. He played a bit of Ranji Trophy, but that's not really of a particularly good standard. So his form in the IPL has been terrific, but we don't know how his red ball game will stand up. So Rahane of 2021 versus 2023, I don't know which version is better. And then you got Pant versus KS Bharat or Kishan, which again we already discussed. That's a huge downgrade. So when you look at the side, their bowling is more or less the same, maybe slightly better due to Mohammad Shami's presence. Their batting, I would say, is actually worse than it was back then because the batting, India's batting lineup is much better suited to Australian conditions than it is to English conditions. So this time around, they'll be playing at the Oval, where I think the conditions will suit them less than what you had at the Gabba. So if you just view it in that sense, I think you could argue that the Indian 11 for this test is even weaker than what they had at the Gabba, purely based on the conditions. The fact that the bowling has remained more or less similar, but the batting will be somewhat hampered by the fact that it is in England and most of the batters don't have good records over there. The one guy who does is Rohit Sharma, and I personally have my reservations over how good he still is, given his form, albeit in different formats, and his age. So I think that's another thing. So Australia, obviously, I think the main thing about the Gabba was not so much the personnel per se, but just the aura and the aura of invincibility that Australia had at that venue. That added to the legend of that test, and not just in terms of like 11 versus 11. They don't have that at the Oval. They don't have any aura of invincibility over this. So in that sense, it would be less of a surprise if India were to win over here. But purely man for man, I think this seems to be almost as big a mismatch as it seemed in 2021. So if India were to come out on top, then if not quite in the same league as the Gabba, this would rank right up there, probably in the top 3 or top 5 of Indian Test wins of all time, if it were to happen. So yeah, I think Australia do start as considerable favorites, much higher favorites than what the bookies would have them as.
I mean, but as you mentioned, right? Stranger things have happened in cricket. And you brought up the Gabba test. One of the most remarkable wins that also happened in Indian cricket that I recall that has some parallels. It's way back. Australia had picked a team in 59-60 to tour India, and they were the best side in the world. They'd thrashed England 4-0 at that point, and they had probably one of the best bowling attacks they've ever assembled. Right, Richie Benaud, Alan Davidson, all of these sorts of players. And India at that time had Gulab Bhai Ramchand, the guy who averaged 45 with the ball, and a bunch of other figures who weren't really of the highest, quality or caliber in terms of the test bowling. They had some good bowlers, but I'm just saying in that context. And India managed to pull out a win. I mean, they lost the series, but they weren't completely outclassed, and they managed to win thanks to a fellow named Jasu Patel who took 14 wickets in the match. So, and he played, only about 8 tests. But I mean, he was a good bowler. There are different reasons why he didn't play, but stranger things have happened in this game, right? Is what I'm trying to point out. So, it is a one-off test. The chances of a variance in result is I would say more than if you had multiple tests where you're evaluating the sides in this particular on this particular surface, or for that matter in a grander series. But yeah, stranger things have happened. So all of us seem to agree Australia are the favorites, but don't be as surprised, or you could have a shock in store. And with that, actually, we'll close out and sign off, guys. I want to thank once again, Stuff and Sanket for you joining the show. Interesting note: we're also in honor of the one-off tests of the world. Me and Stuff are having a series review of the only time these two teams have gotten together and played a one-off test before this, aka the 1996 tour of Australia's to India for a one-off game as well. So stay tuned for that on the channel as well. A lot more things coming up as well. But yeah, till later. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.